welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today I have another sewing project here for you. I was going to do something way more complex this week, but I do not have the time, so we are simplifying. I took a poll over a month ago, 2 months ago. I don't know. I usually take your first and second ranking in those polls and make them, so I'm making your number 2 on this poll. The first was the cape, and I am making this, upside down, like peasant dress, I guess is what I would call it. Anyway, Junior, Mrs. and Mrs. One-Piece dress in vestee. The deep neckline is filled with a vestee. The full skirt in both styles is gathered and topped with corded piping. Corded piping? Style 1 conceals the pockets in the skirt seams and features an eyelet vestee and 3/4 cuff sleeves. Style 2, shown in a border print, has puffed contrast sleeves. Ribbon laces down the bodice. We have a hyper cat who's about to come our way. I'm going to make style number 2 the short sleeve. I don't like 3/4 sleeves. I'm kind of a, like, give me a long sleeve or a short sleeve. Don't give me a 3/4 sleeve, with exception. Of course, there are exceptions to this. What are you doing? Yeah, go on. Go to your windowsill. It seems like the undershirt is a separate piece, which I'm a little bit confused by. I'm excited about this, except for now I'm a little bit confused. Ribbon or laces on dress, 2 yards over 1/2 inch. I'm a little confused by the piping that I'm potentially making. I figured it was a bias binding, but maybe I'm confused. So I'm gonna have to read the instructions and figure that out. I'm feeling a little thrown. I am excited that this has pockets though. I don't plan on making too many alterations to this dress. Mostly I'm just gonna be moving the zipper from the side to the back like I always do. The side zippers are for people with a lot more flexibility and I guess less pain than me. For the busty thing, it says to use an eyelet fabric. I don't think I'm gonna do that. I think I'm just gonna, I have a bunch of like cotton lawn. I'm just gonna use a plain white cotton lawn, but for the main fabric, oh, this is a hefty fabric. This is a fairly thick fabric. I would say it's like maybe a broadcloth question mark. I'm not the best at fabric typing, but it's this really fun, kind of paisley, funky, I think probably 70s. I got this at that dress factory I went to about 1.5 years ago. This was $4 a yard, so however much of this I end up using. 8 5/8 yards. I'm only gonna make this dress out of this fabric, and then I'll probably sell off the rest. There's not too much about this. Hopefully it won't be too complicated. But yeah, I haven't read the instructions yet, so I'm gonna dig into that, and then I'm gonna cut out the pieces. Now I'm a little bit concerned that I don't have enough supplies, I guess, or the right supplies. So yeah, we're gonna dig into this. We're gonna dig into the instructions, and I'm gonna cut out the pieces. I will see you at the cutting out process. First, I started out by cutting this rayon fabric. So this is the white accent fabric I needed, and I decided to use, I had just some scraps left over from my unicorn dirndl that I made in December. I had just barely enough scraps for the pieces of this one, so I decided to do that instead of breaking out an entirely new fabric. And then for the skirt here, I am just ripping my pieces. So the pattern actually is missing all its skirt pieces, but they're rectangles. So I just kind of used my best judgment to decide how much rectangle I needed. I like to rip for square skirts just because it keeps everything on grain, and then also makes it so the edges won't fray. So I'm just kind of doing some measuring here. So I like my back to be fuller than my front. So I make my back pieces bigger than my front piece. My front piece is probably 1/3, and then my back are 1/3 each on each side since I put my zippers in the back. So that is kind of what I'm doing here, is measuring by feel. And then in a sudden stroke of genius, I realized that I could have border print along the waistline, and it actually would probably like work well as a visual break in this very bright colored kind of ditzy fabric print. So that is what I'm doing here. This did make it so I had to use more yardage than I planned on using, because I obviously to make the border print work. However, I'm so happy with the way this worked out. I think this was worth the extra fabric it took. And so I'm just cutting out these pieces as you would, except for I am cutting a center seam down the back because I like to have my zipper back there for the mobility of getting in and out of the dress. I will say marking this fabric was pretty challenging because of all the colors in the fabric. I didn't really have a pen that wasn't a color that was in the fabric because this has so many colors in it. But I figured it out and I did make it work. And then for the pockets, I cut 4 at once because you need 2 to make a pocket, so you need 4 total. And I just cut this all at once because why cut twice when you could cut once? I don't have the skirt pattern pieces. I did also kind of skip some of the marking and stuff and change a little bit how I wanted to do the pocket. I actually changed completely the shape of the pocket. Here I am prepping the bodice for Darts, as you can see, I have a great little helper here. She's really enjoying waving her tail and getting in the way of me marking my darts. And then without my little helper, I am pinning these and getting them all ready to sew on my machine. And then I am just sewing up these darts. Nothing complicated here. I start at the base of the dart, sew to the tip, and then I tie a knot with my hands after the tip of the dart. I just think it looks better than if I backstitch up at the top. And then I'm pressing the darts, and I am also pleased with how this border print is turning out in the bodice. I was a little bit nervous that the darts would make it look super weird, but everything is looking pretty good so far. And then I am pinning and prepping the back seam to baste this because I am putting the zipper in later. This will only be basting stitches, but I like to baste up the back and then press it so that way everything is all flat and ready to go for the zipper. And then for a little bit more efficiency, at the same time, I am going to be working on sewing my facing pieces all together. And then I am just sitting at the machine and basting that in place, as well as then sewing the actual facing pieces together. I just love this fabric, even the back of it. It's very fun. Working with this fabric was a lot of fun because it was so colorful and bright. And then after pressing, I am unpicking all of those basting stitches up the back seam. And then I am pinning the side seams and the shoulder seams together to complete the bodice. I focused here on the pattern matching as opposed to maybe matching notches as strictly. And then I am turning up the facing edge by a 1/4 inch and stitching, so that way I'll have a nice clean edge inside. And then for my seam finishing, I am pinking. This is a nice and very, very, very opaque fabric, so pinking works really well. I do not like pinking on sheer fabrics, but you will not be able to see these seams at all from the outside, so pinking is the way to go because it takes the least amount of time. And then I am just pressing everything to get it ready to put the facings in. And then I am pinning the facing to the bodice, matching all my different markings and stuff. This one was pretty straightforward though because it does have that square bodice front neckline thing. And then after stitching that, I am clipping all of my corners, especially those really, really sharp corners in the bodice. And then I am going to be clipping all my curves to prepare it for understitching. And then after understitching to make it so everything will fold over nicely, I am pressing everything and it's looking really, really great. And then I am moving on to skirt prep. I'm first starting by sewing up that back middle seam. So here I'm starting from the bottom. I am stitching with a normal stitch, but then when I get to where the zipper will be put in, I will switch over to a basting stitch and use the same method I used for the bodice top. And of course, giving everything a good press. I will never not be satisfied by pressing a big, long, straight seam like this. That is really easy and just looks nice. And then here I am pinning in the pockets. So here you can see the pockets are a different shape than the initial pockets I cut out. I like this method for putting in pockets where you sew it at 3/8 of a seam allowance, and then when you sew again, you sew at a 5/8, so the pockets are just pretty hidden in there. And of course, because I don't have the pattern skirt pieces, I didn't want to figure out the markings of the way they have you do the pattern. The thing is the way they have you do this, you would be sewing actually the top into the waistband, and I don't like doing that if I'm gathering because it becomes much more complicated to do all that gathering and figure everything like that out. And here I am sewing it with that 3/8 of a seam. And then I am clipping it and pressing everything open. And then I will pin them on top of each other and get everything ready. I like to use just one seam for the side of the skirt into the pocket. I've done pockets a lot of different ways because vintage patterns like really change throughout the decades how they do pockets, and this is what works best for me in my process. And because this fabric is so sturdy, I'm not as worried as needing the extra support of the waistband on the pocket. And then nothing is worse than a hole in your pocket, so to finish these seams I actually like to use a zigzag stitch around the edges. This is the only time I ever use a zigzag stitch for finishing, and I just like it for pockets because I feel like it gives it just one little extra level of security in case you get a hole in your pocket. And then here I am pressing these seams open and I am pressing the pocket to the front. And then the last thing I am doing is I am putting in the gathering stitches. So here I do not want gathering in the front 8 inches. I want it all on the sides and the back, so I am putting in my gathering stitches accordingly. All right, good morning. I am started on day 2 of this project. I got pretty far on day 1 since I did the kickoff in the morning. I did both the cutting and the bodice, I planned on finishing it, but then my storage unit, which I have in my apartment building, it's like down on the first floor, it flooded, so I've been kind of dealing with some of the chaos from that. All my stuff is fine. Something I've always done and something I recommend you do if you do have a storage unit in like a bottom basement area is know those are the most prone to flooding, so I always have the first foot to 2 feet be stuff that will be okay if it gets wet. So I just had to dry, but it means I have all of my storage stuff in my small 1-bedroom apartment right now, which is like not ideal. So I am now a little bit more behind on this project than I wanted to be. So let's go ahead and I guess show you what I have here. I have the bodice pretty much done except for the sleeves and the vestee, I believe is what they call it, the thing that goes here to cover myself, I think, because otherwise this is actually, it's not as low cut as I thought. However, it is what kind of completes the look. The next step they actually had was attaching this to the skirt, which I also finished yesterday. I wanted to hold up until I had the sleeves and the vestee on this because this is way easier to tackle on its own than with all the skirt attached. I'm going to be just getting this finished up today, I think. I feel pretty optimistic on that. It is about 10:30 right now when I'm starting this, and I think I can finish it today. Famous last words, but I really do think this time I can finish it today. I'm doing a couple alterations in both the sleeve and the vestee just because since this is, I think this is a pattern from 1951, if I recall. There's just some more modern construction methods that I'm going to use. As I mentioned in the cutting out, I didn't have the pattern pieces for the skirt at all, which is totally fine because they were just rectangle pieces, but that means that I have to figure that out as well. So I'm gonna, go ahead and I guess get into it. I don't think I have anything else to tell y'all about other than this is turning out better than I had thought. I had just felt iffy about this fabric for a little bit, but now that it's starting to take shape into a garment, I really, really like this fabric. Let's go ahead and hop into it. So first here, I am putting in my marking of where the gathering line is supposed to go. And then I am also marking my gathering lines for the front shirt piece that goes in the bodice. And then I'm going off direction on the pattern here. So in the pattern, they have you just use a gathering stitch and you like basically tie it off, and that's how the sleeves keep their shape. I wanted to change it to elastic because elastic is a lot more comfortable and allows a lot more room for flexibility. So I'm first starting actually by sewing up the side seam of the sleeve. And I was not thinking enough ahead to remember to do a French seam, so here I am just using a seam binding on that side seam. And then for the front band, I am just putting in those gathering stitches. I am also adding in gathering stitches to the sleeve head and hemming the bottom of the sleeve with a very small double turn hem. And then I am pressing everything to make sure it is ready for the elastic channels. For the elastic channels, I am just using some rayon seam binding tape, and I am sewing down each side according to where the line is on the sleeve. This will make a channel for the elastic to go through. And then I have left a little slit opening for the elastic to actually go through, and I'm just going to thread this through using the safety pin method. Here I am first putting it in where when I did that seam, the seam bound seam, I pressed it to one side, and I am putting the elastic in the direction of that so I don't have to figure out how to maneuver the safety pin back out of the channel as opposed to get it stuck under the seam, if that makes sense. And then here I have the sleeves done, so I am sewing them into the shoulder cap of the bodice. In the pattern instructions, they don't have you putting on the sleeves till after you've put the skirt on, but I don't know why you would want to move all that extra weight around when you could put the sleeves in before. And from here, it's time to move on to the focus of the bodice. I have cut my bias tape, and then that piece down below you see is the guide for the gathering. You're supposed to have all your different marks lining up. However, there weren't as many marks on the bottom as there were, like on the template, as there were to be marked on the piece that I'm gathering. So this was a little bit confusing, but I feel like I did make it work. Here I have 2 lines of gather stitch on both the top and the bottom. And I am first really focusing on getting the top gathered down so that way it is ready to be put into the bias tape trim at the top. And then once I have that all figured out, I am then figuring out the gathering for the bottom. This was actually kind of tricky because I was trying to get the gathers to feel pretty even though the bottom, like the top is smaller than the bottom. So it was just a little bit tricky, but I, after lots of futzing around, managed to make it work. After stitching the bias tape to the bodice top, I am now hand sewing the other side of that bias tape down. I just think this makes for a nicer finish, and this tape is in such a prominent spot that I want to make sure it looks as good as possible. And then in the instructions, it tells you to finish the seams, but it gives you no suggestions on how to do so. So I'm going ahead and I'm using a seam binding tape to finish these seams. So with that, I'm just sewing it down on one side and then folding it over and sewing it down again. I am gathering down the skirt to the bodice. Again, I did not have the skirt pattern, so I made kind of a guess on how much of a skirt to make, and I did end up with more skirt volume than I could actually attach to the bodice. So I fixed that by, at the very front, adding kind of like 2 pleats that will hopefully add even more emphasis to my hips, which is what I want for this dress. You'll understand what I'm talking about when you see it at the end. And then with the bodice sewn to the skirt, I am now ready to install the zipper. Here I'm using a zipper foot. I do not like to use pins for my zipper. I find it way easier to knot. And I put that zipper tape actually up into the facing so it disappears and folds over and gives you a very, very sturdy like top of your zipper. And then I'm just gonna sew down that zipper, sew around and sew back up, and my zipper will be installed. Zippers are no longer as scary as they once were. And then at this point I can try it on. So I have checked with the hem and I actually don't want to hem it very much. The bottom of the skirt is already a finished seam, so I just have to fold it over once, and I'm just folding it over about a 1/2 inch. And now we're to both simultaneously my most favorite and least favorite part. Don't totally know how that worked. Also, Spooky is sitting against me and purring, so if you hear that, enjoy it, I guess. But here I am just hand stitching that hem down. This is really nice because this fabric is so thick and then also has so much color in it. It's really easy to make the thread on the front really, really invisible. And then before I did the facing and actually stitched it down, I remembered there actually needed to be eyelet holes here, so I am just putting the eyelets in with my machine. So here I stitch the eyelet once and then I stitch it exactly the same spot a second time to make sure I have a really, really dense eyelet. And then here I am trying to figure out exactly how this like bodice piece lays in. This was again pretty tricky, trying to figure out how to match dots and get everything ready to be sewn down. I've already sewn the facing down at this point, so I'm just trying to figure out exactly how this sits in so it will be like fairly seamless feeling and not be uncomfortable. It was just kind of tricky to get pinned in there, but once it was pinned and looked good, it was pretty easy from there. And here I'm actually stitching that down. I used black thread for this just because it will blend better if it does pop in the front than obviously if I used white, even though it does make for a kind of ugly back. And then here I'm trying to show you this, but it's rather challenging because I have dark thread on dark fabric, but I'm making little tiny like loops for the lacing to go down the front. This is how the pattern instructs you to do it. It's kind of like basically making a tiny loop and then buttonhole stitching around it. It's similar to how you would do if you were going to be putting in like a belt loop, but on a really, really tiny scale. So that is what I'm doing here, and that is the last thing I have to do, and then I am ready to show you the reveal of this dress. All right, you have seen the reveal. I hope you enjoyed that, and let's go ahead and jump into the cost breakdown. I have my little spreadsheet here. This was such a cheap dress, all things considered. The fabric only cost me $20 because I needed 5 yards of it and I paid $4 a yard. And then the white fabric that I used, I didn't count that because that fabric was counted in the total for my unicorn dirndl dress. And I didn't even use, I would say, like a full yard. Like I was really like moving it around trying to get those scraps to work for me, so I didn't count the fabric there. And then the notions only cost $4.02 because all we had was a zipper, a hook and eye, and I only used one roll of thread. So yeah, $402 was the total for that. That was it. And then the pattern was cheaper because I picked it up at an antique mall and it was missing that skirt piece. So the pattern was only $12. So that brings us to a total of $36.02 for this dress. I adore this dress, so I'm more than happy with that price. That is the price of like a fast fashion Shein type of dress, and it is not Shein quality. So I am more than happy with that. I think that is a great price for me to have paid for this dress. It is the perks of when I'm lucky enough to find good fabric secondhand. I would say it's not going to be typical to find this type of fabric for that cost. With that, for as far as labor goes, it took me 10 hours to make this dress. This is actually a decently short timeline for me to make a dress on. I think it's just because this one was so simple and there wasn't a ton of hand sewing I needed to do, and anytime I reduce the hand sewing, it reduces the time by quite a bit. As you know, on this channel, we believe in a living wage. The living wage in Seattle is $32.70 an hour. I believe seamstresses should get paid a living wage. So that brings us to a labor total of $327 of labor that went into this dress, which brings us to a grand total of $363.02. Just something to think about when you're looking at a garment that you picked up somewhere and it's $50. Just think about, given this cost breakdown, what's actually going back to the garment worker that is making the dress. Nothing's made by machine. Well, I mean, they're made by a sewing machine, but all garments have to be constructed by human hands using a sewing machine, and these women work in terrible conditions. Cheap clothing is great for that quick hit, but just think about kind of the impact you're having on other people's lives. So that is just kind of why I do this little labor breakdown, is to make you think more critically about what clothing should cost if the laborer is making them or paid fairly. With that, here's the dress. I love this dress. I think this is probably my favorite dirndl style dress. I think reusing this fabric from my unicorn dirndl was a great choice. The peasantness of this dress was perfect, and I'm really proud of my last minute idea to have the pattern placement around the waist, as well as my choice to gather the skirt with it flat in the front and then more gathered on the hips. I think this just really proves silhouette is about an optical illusion. So this actually is a dress that is technically the largest dress I've made, like as far as waist fit. Again, I am still very small and I'm still very privileged. However, I would say actually this is one of my dresses that makes my waist look the smallest because it's so poofy down here. So I just always think that's something to remember about clothing, is that before, I would say before the 60s, probably into the 60s and 70s, we actually had undergarments that made the clothes fit us. We didn't make our bodies fit a silhouette. We were using a bunch of illusions to build a silhouette. Like nobody in the Victorian era, like well, not nobody, but like the bosom with the tiny waist and then the big hips were all illusions done through padding. Because yeah, I would say that this dress makes my waist look so small, but this dress, when I actually measure it flat, is the largest waist I have sewn for myself. So I just think that's always something to keep in mind about clothing and silhouettes. And I think some of that is also the addition of this pattern that really brings that focal point. But yeah, just always something to think about. And then I did wear this dress to work today, and I only had a half day at work because I had to take Spooky to the vet. She's having some stuff going on. Oh, are you hiding? And she's still traumatized. Nothing too big to update you guys about right now on her health. Those of you who've been around a while know she has kidney issues. I adopted her with kidney issues as well as missing a leg. We're finding something that looks like a bladder stone but isn't symptoming like a bladder stone right now, so we're trying to get to the bottom of that. My vet is wonderful, and she's also like annoyed she can't solve this puzzle. So Spooky's in great hands, and she hasn't lost weight. She hasn't been looking sick. So we're not really worried that anything is hugely wrong with her. We're just trying to get ahead of whatever it is. So don't stress too much for Spooky. I'm trying not to stress too much for Spooky until I have any other updates on her health. But yeah, we are kind of currently in cycles of like every 2 weeks having a vet trip for various tests to try to figure out what's going on. We were gonna just do bladder stone removal surgery on her, but the vet doesn't want to do surgery unless that's 100% positive, and at this point, after not having bladder stone symptoms, even though it looks like a bladder stone, they just aren't sure enough to be willing to open her up. Next step might be an ultrasound for her, which means she'll have a very, very fuzzy, velvety belly because she'll get shaved again. Get another look at that leg scar, I'm sure. But yeah, she's doing okay though. Like I said, don't worry too much about her, but send her all the love and good thoughts. Sorry, that really got off track. But I have worn this for a full day. It's really pretty comfortable. I did wear it a little bit for lounging on the couch. Not a good lounging on the couch dress. I wouldn't have guessed that it would be though. This would not be my first pull for a lounging on the couch type of dress. As far as things I would do better, can't name one. Like I have talked about on previous videos, my sewing skills have just gotten so much better. My knowledge has gotten so much better. The seams in this are all finished. I have my little Made by Haylee Marie and Spooky tag. Zipper looks good. Okay, I was like, I couldn't remember if I finished the waist seam because it's become such habit. Waist seam's finished. I will say, I guess you could maybe call these seams unfinished, but they were ripped on the grain, so I consider that basically finished. And then of course for the sleeves, I did a matching seam binding with the fabric. See, I don't always remember how I finished the inside of my garments. I now finished them to a point where they no longer ever bother me. I don't think to look at how I finished them. Past me surprises me and maybe concerns me about my memory since I finished this like 4 days ago, and the fact I already forgot all the finishing seams I put in. I'm also getting better about adding this hook and eye up here because it does really help out. I guess this is probably technically like not my best zipper installation, but it's certainly not my worst. And yeah, I absolutely love the way the gatherings sit on here. I like the modifications I made and the fact that this is elastic. This is much more comfy than if it had just been a straight up gathered stitch that was then sewn in. I do want to know if you noticed in the reveal, I'm sure you probably couldn't, there's some yellowing up here. And I think I just didn't properly rinse the blue marker out, so I think I need to take another round of rinsing to get that out, and then that should be just fine. The only other maybe like critique I would have is I'm not sure I love the color of this. I think I would like to get a neon, like a more neon pink to actually match the pink in the dress, or a teal that matches the teal in the dress. So I will probably swap that out at some point, but that's just like a small nitpicky thing. Otherwise, yeah, I think this dress is perfection. I think it will have a very long life with me. I also have lots of like this type of movement in it, which we love. Overall, it is a fantastic dress for me, and I'm very happy with it. I feel like this is the first time in a little bit I've done like a really basic dress. So it's nice to see that I still feel like my new sewing brain applies to a simpler dress and it doesn't just have to be done on these big complicated projects. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. You will see another sewing video for me in 2 weeks, and we'll have some sort of other content next week. I post every single Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. As always, I do have a Ko-Fi if you want to leave me a tip over there. As you can see, I put a lot of time and labor into this channel, and a lot of that labor is not paid. You can always support me for free by liking this video or commenting down below, and of course subscribing and sticking around for my next sewing adventure. And I will see you next time. Bye!